So the purpose of this speaker series is to explore how insights in behavioral science affect society, shape policy, impact business, and also affect our everyday lives in ways that hopefully understanding will enable us to improve human life in some meaningful way. And tonight I'm delighted to welcome Alex Todorov, my friend, and one of our newest, maybe our newest faculty member in the behavioral science group. Alex spent the last 20 or so years at Princeton, just a tad under, and he joined us in January of 2021 during that pandemic space-time warp that both feels like forever ago and yesterday all at once. So we don't know if you've been here for a long time or a little time, but we're delighted to have you here with us in Chicago. And I believe this is probably the first sort of biggish public event he's given since he's been here, so we'll have to give him a warm welcome in just a moment. I've learned from Alex many times over, both from his research and from talking with him, that what you think you see in someone often doesn't match the reality of that person. So, for instance, in Alex, you might see someone who looks very smart, clearly academic, a cool academic at that, but there's a lot more to him than that. Turns out, Alex is also a wicked fast sprinter. You wouldn't have guessed that. So wicked fast that he is nationally ranked in the top 25 in his age group in the United States. I won't tell you what age group that is, but if you don't like his talk tonight, you're not going to catch him running after him to chase him down to tell him that. I also see someone in Alex, I see someone who looks like they were driven to be an academic, given how well he succeeded over the course of his career. But when I asked him, Alex, how is it that you got here being at the University of Chicago? And he said, a huge amount of luck and randomness. That is, it was not really an intentional thing, much at all. So Alex was in his second year in college in Bulgaria when the communist system there sort of broke up. And that allowed him to look elsewhere for places to continue his education. He got lucky and got an open society fellowship that allowed him to go to Oxford at the same time that he got into a PhD program at the New School for Social Research in New York. He actually thought he should go to the New School first instead of going to Oxford. And his advisor there told him that he was insane, that no, you should go to Oxford, which he did. Got him inspired in psychology, also convinced him that he needed to go to a slightly different PhD program. When he came back to New York, he benefited from a policy in New York of being able to attend classes at any school in New York if you are in a graduate program in one of them. That got him connected to NYU, got him enrolled in the PhD program there, connected to a few advisors, and one lucky break after another happened. And now he's here. Not necessarily intentional, but a lot of happy accidents brought him here. And in Alex, I also see, just looking over the course of his research career, someone who seems very deeply focused on one particular fundamental problem in psychology or in social psychology, namely, how is it that the most basic of all social stimuli affects our minds, namely the human face? So I thought there must be some deep-seated interest in the face and understanding the face in Alex. And so I asked him about this yesterday. And he said, no, actually not. That early in his career, it turns out he kind of stumbled on a really big finding, which he's going to describe a little bit to you tonight. Turns out that a person's appearance predicts election outcomes. That was surprising. And in talking with his colleagues at Princeton, one of them, Nobel Prize winner Danny Kahneman, suggested to him that, hey, you probably want to start a research program on something rather than doing somewhat scattered research. And this face stuff seems kind of interesting. And so that's exactly what Alex did. And one thing led to another, and led to another, and led to another. And after 20 years, Alex's work has really fundamentally changed the way we as psychologists understand what people see when they look in the face of another person. And one of Alex's most fundamental insights, at least interesting insights from my perspective, is that there's a lot more to a person's face than you actually see when you look at them. In fact, what we see in somebody often doesn't reflect reality much at all. And I think Alex might even argue to us a little bit tonight that it almost never reflects the truth about a person. So with that, please join me in a hearty welcome of Alex, not just to this event here tonight, but to the University of Chicago itself.
Thank you, Nick. Oops. Thank you, Nick. I guess this was the most interesting introduction I ever had. So, so what do we see in a face? Well, there's actually more than 100 years of good research on faces in cognitive neuroscience, in cognitive science, in social psychology. And faces are really special. So I'll just give you a couple of reasons. One, newborns with virtually no visual experience prefer to look at faces than at equally complex objects. Two, primate brains contain neurons that selectively respond to faces, and these neurons are usually concentrated in a few selective regions in the inferior temporal cortex. So our brains are really specialized to process faces. We are face experts. From the moment we are born, we are exposed to thousands of faces. So very subtle differences in facial appearance, we can detect it. So it's easy to discriminate between two faces. And we form impressions from extremely little information. So let me give you a demo. So I want you to fixate on the circle, and then a face will appear very briefly, on the order of 50 to 100 milliseconds. And let's see what you would see. So if I have to make a guess, was it a man or a woman? Woman. Race? Asian. Emotion? Smiling. Exactly. So very rapid presentation, and yet you can extract this demographic information from it. So impressions from facial appearance are extremely efficient. Typically about 100 millisecond exposure to the face is sufficient to read off demographic attributes like race, age, things like emotional states, cognitive states like effort and exhaustion, focus of attention, eye gaze. It's not that you make this decision within 100 milliseconds. That's the time it takes the information to get from your retina to the parts of the brain that process faces, but within half a second, you're basically done. And this is the case even if the signals are very subtle. So if I ask you who is the male or who is the female here, this is the gender illusion, how many people think that the face on your left is the male face? So there's a clear consensus. It's exactly the same face in every respect, except that the skin is made a little bit darker of the male face. That's a gender illusion. As it happened, in every culture that people have measured, men within the same ethnicity, men tend to be darker than women. And you can look at the palm of the hand, so it's not just about sun exposure or something, maybe men just work outside. So there's this seems to be a stable biological difference. These impressions also could be fairly surprising. It turns out that information from the face could be even revealing about underlying health in the case of the elderly. That is, how old one looks relative to their biological age. So if you look at these two faces, this was a very large study done on twins in Denmark, I believe over 7,000. And what they did, they looked at 70 years old people, and they tracked them for a very long time, basically looking how long they're going to live. Now you see morph of the twin that looked younger, you should be able to detect on the left side, and the twin that looked older. It turns out that next to the best predictor, especially when you're old, how long you're going to live is obviously biological age. Turns out that the second next best is not a DNA test or anything like that, but how old you look relative to your biological age. So people who looked younger actually lived longer. And at first sight, it's actually quite amazing. How is this possible? What is happening? But it's not really that surprising if you start digging inside behind the data. What makes you look younger? Well, the face, after all, is part of the body, right? So when you're aging, if your body is aging, your face is aging too. The first reason is genetic luck. There's nothing you can do about this. The second, though, is socioeconomic status and access to healthcare. If you're wealthier, you have better access to healthcare, you're going to look better. Lack of chronic conditions, like asthma, Chronic sun exposure, not like vacations outside, but being a farmer or a fisherman, that's also very bad. Smoking, turns out it's terrible for your appearance, among other things. So this all of the things that will make you look older, and so you can think of these accumulated advantages and disadvantages in life. They do get imprinted on our bodies and on our faces, which after all are part of our bodies. But what a lot of my work has been on a set of inferences that are much more problematic. It turns out that, again, after extremely brief exposure, people could make all sorts of inferences of complex and presumably stable personality attributes, like whether the person is trustworthy, whether the person is competent, aggressive, and so on and so on. In fact, these are the kinds of inferences who have a very, very long history of historic fascination. Nobody cared about the brain processing, the face processing mechanisms in the brain, but people always cared, at least since we started living in modern states, about can you read the personality of people from their faces. In fact, this is what I call the physiognomist promised. Physiognomy is the pseudoscience of reading character from faces. And the main promise is that you can actually infer others' character from their appearance. The first treatise on physiognomy is actually attributed to Aristotle, so it goes to ancient Greece, but it really, really picked up in the 18th and the 19th century. This was the cover of maybe the first Swiss bestseller by Johann Caspar Lavater, who was a clergy in Zurich and was extremely influential and prolific writer. He wrote these 4 volumes on essays on physiognomy. Some of the best illustrators worked on the books. None other than Goethe helped him with the first edition. So it was a really very popular and highly influential book in Europe. Just to give you one brief anecdote, Darwin was almost denied the chance to take the historic Beagle voyage on the account of his nose, and you can entertain his nose. Why? Because the captain of Beagle happened to be a fan of Lavater, and he didn't believe that a person with such a nose would possess sufficient energy and determination for the voyage. Luckily for science, Darwin made it, and he wrote in his autobiography, but I think he was afterwards well satisfied that my nose had spoken falsely. And there are much more serious, actually, effects. By the way, noses, for some reasons, were huge in the 18th and 19th century. There was a whole branch of physiognomy called nosology, and there are whole books dedicated to reading character of people from their noses. So in some way, this is all funny, and it's a ridiculous notion, but the physiognomist promise is alive and well. Primarily because we are all naive physiognomists forming and acting on impressions from faces, forming instantaneous impressions and acting on them. So let me give you a few demonstrations. Imagine that you're walking into a party, and these are the first 2 people you're going to see. How many people will approach the face on your left? Okay, clear majority, right? You can change it in a hiring context and say, imagine you're hiring a salesperson. Who would you hire? Would be the same decision. Now, all of the faces that I'm showing you were not created by an artist. They're generated by a mathematical model that visualizes our impressions of different traits. So in this particular case, this is our impressions of extroversion and introversion. So you have a prototypical extroverted face on your left, prototypical introverted face. If you're going to a party and your objective is to have fun, this is the person you would likely approach. You might be wrong, for all you know, but not knowing anything else, that's what you're going to do. Well, who would make a better CEO, the person on the left or the person on the right? How many people think the person on your right will make a better CEO? Again, so it's a clear consensus, maybe not as much as the first one. This is a model of perceived competence. And so you make the face look more competent, and it has a resulting effect on decisions. You can apply to real faces. I can tell you these are twins, the evil and the good twin. Who is the evil twin? And chances, of course, the face on your left would be the evil twin. Or You can make it positive and say if you're hiring a security guard, who would you hire? And in this case, we just put a little bit of masculinity in the face. And once you introduce masculinity in the face, it comes with all of these other stereotypes. The person is physically stronger, the person is physically aggressive, and so on and so on. And now to your cookies. This is who is more trustworthy. If you're hiring a babysitter, who would you hire? Again, it would be, I am not even going to ask, but obviously you would think the person on your right. This is from a new model. One of my postdocs was a leading figure, Stefan, who is sitting here in the first row. And I'll tell you about this model in a second. So what is important is that this impression from face is immediate and compelling. You don't stop to think for a minute and say, well, let me compare the eyebrows, let me compare the different facial angle and come up with a decision. It's just you have an instantaneous decision. In fact, we can measure this. I already showed you earlier demonstration with demographic characteristics, but you get exactly the same face with this complex social judgment. So I can show you a face, then we use something called perceptual masking because you want this to interfere with your perceptual processing. So you really know that the stimulus is presented for the time you intend to present it. And the basic finding is that you can start with from subliminal exposure where nothing happens, people a chance. You go to 30 milliseconds, people starting agreeing with their judgment if they have unlimited time. And by the time it's 160, 170 milliseconds, they're done. They don't need more time. This is kind of literally single glance impressions because that's the time it takes to move your eyes. And eye movements is the way how we collect information in the world. The second thing is that the impressions from faces are consequential. So again, I'll ask you to focus on the next slide. Pay attention. Who is more competent? Again, if you do it in a experimental context, that's enough exposure for people to make a judgment. These were actually gubernatorial candidates, I believe, in a race in Virginia in the early 2000s. And in a series of studies, Nick mentioned this study, the first study that I stumbled upon and made me truly interested in studying faces. We simply had actually naive judgment of Princeton students looking at faces of politicians. They didn't even know they were looking at politicians. I actually think this was one of the elections was when Barack Obama was running for the US Senate. So we removed pictures of familiar, famous people. And it turned out that just using these judgments, we can predict about 70% of the election outcomes. It works just enough for gubernatorial elections too. Political scientists have followed up on this work. And now we know that the effect is really driven by people who know next to nothing about politics and who watch TV, which makes a lot of sense from psychological point of view. We talk about heuristic processing. So they're substituting a complex decision, complex question, how competent is the candidate, with a very easy question, how competent they look. So in a sense, they're looking for the right information in the wrong place because it's easy. And that's, for you, the story of why we have psychological heuristic in decision making. There are many other findings. These are not from my lab group, from other groups. Competent-looking CEOs are more likely to get high compensation packages. They're not necessarily better CEOs, but they get high compensation packages. Trustworthy-looking borrowers are more likely to get loans and with lower interest rate. This was done on a website, I believe, prosper.com, but the loans are not trivial, up to $25,000, and they have the credit card, the credit history of the person. They have a history of previous defaults. So there's lots of information, good information that should lead you to better prediction, and yet putting a picture was good. In fact, people who had a picture made it them more likely to get a loan. So having a picture is better than not having a picture. And then having the right picture is the best. So these people got more likely to get loans and with lower interest rate. Work that is much older, dominant-looking cadets are more likely to achieve higher military ranks, and the list goes on and on. And there are lots of experimental demonstrations. These are sort of effects in the real world, but you can think of the first demonstration. If you run a study, you can see that there's a very clear consensus what the judgments are going to be. And lately, this is the part that is actually a bit, well, not a bit, quite worrisome. You have lots of new technological startups promising profiling personalities based on facial images alone. You have scientific publications claiming that they can read from facial images alone criminal inclination, sexual orientation, political orientation, and so on. So I will address this at the end of my talk. So physiognomy is here. Has never gone away, just this new clothes, the emperor's new clothes. And yet, the promise is deeply flawed and disturbing in its implications. Why is that? Well, first, why is the physiognomy's promise so appealing? Well, it promises an easy solution to a complex problem. And the complex problem is how to figure out the intentions and capabilities of other people, of strangers. You're stuck with strangers since the moment. I think Jared Diamond had a great line that once we started living in modern states, maybe 13,000 years ago or something along this line, it was the first time in human history when you encounter strangers, you didn't have to kill them. You know, before the decision was easy, but now it's difficult. Like what do I do with this person? This is interesting in historical context. So in early 20th century, Catherine Blackford and Arthur Newcomb had a bunch of books that were super influential. And they were the modern physiognomy of early 20th century. So the arguments were not based on Lavater's really flimsy logic, but it was based on evolutionary theory. Of course, that was also very flimsy, but nonetheless, the arguments were different. And in fact, Catherine Blackford had some great ideas. You can think of her as a precursor of the modern human resources departments. So the idea here is how to solve the problem of finding the right person for the job. And she had specific ideas. Forget about, just look at them, and you can do this character analysis based on appearance from the interview. Whatever they say, it doesn't matter. Letter of recommendations, they're worthless. That's not true. They're not high predictors. They're much better predicted than structured interviews. And so this had quite a bit of influence in the early 20th century. This was exactly the time where psychologists were working and saying, wait a minute, there's not that much accuracy in this late judgment. How did you come up with this? Well, this is from modern work. So here, this is a scatter plot to illustrate this is a meta-analysis of thousands of studies looking at the relationship between impressions from unstructured interviews. Like there's a difference from a structured interview which has been validated and maps into specific abilities and unstructured interviews. The correlation is positive, by the way. It's about 0.15. But human eyes start seeing correlations when they're in the order of 0.60. So there is a signal there, but it's extremely weak. It's like 4 times weaker than a letter of recommendations, because letter of recommendations, they just have a larger sample of observations. So I think this is quite illuminating. I just generated to see what exactly this means. If you ask people to estimate what's the correlations between their impressions and how the person will do on the job, it's about 0.60. And that's what people like Dick Nisbet, I think, and Lee Ross call the interview illusion, thinking that you learn a lot about the person. You learn nothing, basically. Here's another thing that if you haven't read The Moneyball, that's a fantastic book, or you can also watch the movie with Brad Pitt, as obviously Billy Bean, but the book is much more illuminating. Why is this interesting? Well, the whole book is about the unlikely success of Billy Bean, who is the general manager of Oakland A's, a baseball team. By the way, I know nothing about baseball, and still it's a fascinating book. But why he's been so successful? He will work with much smaller revenues than the other teams, and yet he would be consistently one of the best teams. And what he was doing, he was exploiting the prejudices of appearance. So he would find players who are under their market value because they didn't look the part. So here's quotes from Michael Lewis' book. Billy Bean was looking for those guys who for their whole career had seen their accomplishments understood with an asterisk. The footnote at the bottom of the page said, he'll never go anywhere because he doesn't look like a big league ball player. Young men who have failed the first test of looking good in uniform. I mean, actually the scouts, they had a proverb, the good face, and Billy Bean had the good face. Turned out that he was a failure as a professional player, and he took this lesson. And then he decided to move to management, and people were all surprised. And then he was spectacular. Fascinating character. And another thing from Michael Lewis, what begins as a failure of the imagination ends as a market inefficiency. When you rule out an entire class of people from doing a job simply by their appearance, you're less likely to find the best person for the job. So things have turned quite a bit if you look at the data from the arguments of Newcomb and Bradford. Generally, predicting human behavior, it's a very difficult business. So when you're thinking about this, that's just to put you a few things in your mind. The typical correlations between a validated personality measure, that is a questionnaire like extroversion or neuroticism or depression, there are lots of validated, they have good psychometric properties. And yet the correlation between these measures and specific behaviors, it's on the order of 0.30. Okay, so that is very low. The correlations between a general attitude, how much I care about politics, and specific behavior like will I go and vote in the midterm election, it's about 0.20. The correlations between two behaviors that presumably map the same trait, for example, cheating on a test and lying to your parents, the correlation is 0.20. Okay, so why would one think that you would get a single glance at a face and you get better prediction from things that actually, like the behaviors, there are lots of observations, hours of observations, personality measures that are validated, and so on and so on. Well, the second reason why the physiognomist promise is so appealing is because it actually does agree with our intuitions. We have these rapid, efficient impressions, and they seem to be shared with others. And here, this is an important caveat with others like us. Yes, anything that you visualize would be based on the population of raters. And so there would be differences between members of even different families, different friends group, different ethnicities, different cultures, and so on and so on. There would be some agreement, but there would be always more agreement within the people who know each other. In fact, for the intuitions, and a lot of the work that we've done, and we did this about 15 years ago, we can actually visualize these impressions. So all of the faces that I showed you in the beginning, they were generated by different statistical models. And the logic is very simple, but you can think that each face is just a set of numbers. We can randomly generate lots of thousands of different faces, and then we can throw them at people, ask them to rate them on anything you like, attractiveness, trustworthiness, and then we can build a statistical model that captures what's the variation. Is there something systematic in the original random variation in the faces? This is what we call in psychology data-driven analysis. That is, we don't manipulate anything a priori. I don't say, well, let me manipulate the smiling, the distance between the eyes, none of it. We just let the features vary randomly. And this is what you get. So this is a model of trustworthiness. And the score on the running score would be the perceived trustworthiness according to the model. Very trustworthy, 6 standard deviations. And now it becomes untrustworthy. We always validate these models, but one thing that I love about these researches is the moment you see the stimuli, you know that it works, right? We always generate now novel faces. We manipulate them based on these models. We give it to new participants and make sure that, in fact, the model predictions match into human judgments. And they do. Now, what did you see there? I mean, once when the face becomes more trustworthy, it starts smiling. We actually made absolutely sure that the face was emotionally neutral. Yet, very subtle difference in the face that suggests smiliness, it's picked up. So the model is like an amplifier, right? You pick up whatever signal is, and then you turn up the volume, and you see, oh, oops, emotional expressions emerged. The face becomes more feminine, the trustworthy face. It's another very strong signal, and it goes with the gender stereotypes. We generally trust women more than men. Okay, so here's one of my favorite models, the extroversion. Now the face becomes really extroverted, so happy to see you. and now it's becoming introverted. As I said, this was a work that we've done a while ago and way before the huge advances in computer science in the last 10 years, what people call deep neural nets, and this is the work that Stefan has been heavily involved. So all of these faces here are not real. They might look real. I'm sure you probably have seen it. Like every other month, there's an article in the Times or another publication of hyper-realistic faces. So this was generated from a model that has been trained on 70,000 faces. And so you can generate faces that are hyper-realistic. They might resemble to a face that you know, but they're not real. And we can generate as many as we want. And here they're simply ordered based on their perceived trustworthiness. On the top, kids are perceived as way more trustworthy. And then smiling people with direct gaze, they're perceived as trustworthy. And the least trustworthy are usually men. They don't have happy expressions. There's no direct eye gaze, and so on and so on. So this is the basic task. We generate random faces. We ask people to rate the faces. And then, again, each face is just a set of numbers. We use the same conceptual logic, and then we build a model. And here's the model of perceived trustworthiness. So we can apply it to novel faces, and becomes a little bit younger. Expression, of course, changes. And you can do this for everything. So here's just another example. This is the least and the most outgoing faces. Again, these are randomly generated hyper-realistic faces. And then we can apply this to a new face. And you can see expression changes, of course. The eye gaze becomes direct. Notice it's not just the face. The sunglasses become much brighter. And here's your model of outgoing. And we can do this forever. Like, it works beautifully for skinny or not skinny, for age, for all of these attributes. But it works also for these sorts of social attributes. Now, what is really, really important is to realize what the models are doing. So the models capture systematic biases and judgments. They visualize our stereotypes. They're not capturing, oh, that's what an extroverted person looks like. That's what a trustworthy person looks like. I'll elaborate on the argument as I go along. They visualize stereotypes of a particular group. So all of these models, originally a lot of this was done in Princeton, and then the rest was done on MTurk, so the vast majority are Caucasian participants. In fact, we had judgment looks like me, familiar, and they all clustered together. Right? So it is specific to the group that generates the judgments. They do not capture personality characteristics. And this is the difference in the work that we do and the physiognomist work. In the physiognomist promise, there is this deep assumption that confuses the impression, your cognitive and emotional response, with the real thing. It also assumes that there's one-on-one mapping from faces to facial images. Now, if you just think about your pictures, if you're not fully narcissistic, there are pictures that you like and pictures that you don't like, right? So it just takes a 30 seconds of reflection that images don't represent us in the same way. That's why we always like to have great photographers who can make us look much better than we actually look most of the time, right? And as a result, it underestimates the huge effects of image variations and impressions. So before I give you this demonstration, why do we form this? What's the source of these first impressions? Where are they coming from? Well, they're grounded in momentary mental states. So you saw emotional signals emerging very clearly in the different models. They're grounded in stereotypes like masculinity, femininity, age. They're heavily dependent on the specific and the image variation. So they're constructed from cues that have some significance in the immediate situation. Let me tell you about momentary mental states. I think this study was done in Sweden. I just really like this study. I haven't done it, but obviously the same person, right? Now, if you show these two pictures to two different groups of people, And you ask them to rate the person, is he more attractive? So the person, I think it's on your right? People think, well, he's not very attractive, he's not very smart, he's kind of like, I don't know, there's something with him. Do you know what the difference is?
The weight is there. This one is like a little bit chubbier. I mean, he's not chubby, but he's a little bit.
Sleep deprivation. So same person, you go to the lab, take your picture while you have slept very well, then 24 hours you don't sleep. And then your picture is taken under the same standardized conditions. That's the difference. And that's a momentary mental state. I mean, the guy is exhausted, you can see. And in fact, when we are sleep deprived, we don't look very good. Moreover, I mean, we are also not very smart. And we do stupid things when we are sleep deprived. So know that this inference, not very smart, it's actually accurate for the momentary state here and now. And that's the reason you don't want to be sleep deprived or exhausted when you're engaging in a complex task. So the inference is fine, but saying that, well, that's what the person is like, that's a huge inferential leap. It's the same person, just two different mental states. So it is fine in the immediate situation, but it's not warranted as an inference about the intelligence of the person. You have overgeneralization from stereotypes. Baby-faced individuals, there was a lot of work. Leslie Zebrowitz from Brandeis University has done lots of work way before I was in this field, showing that people make all kinds of inferences based on impressions of adults whose faces are more baby face-like or not. And as one example, they're perceived as naive and not physically tough. She has done some research with longitudinal research with teenagers which suggest otherwise. Presumably, they're working hard to overcome the stereotypes, so they tend to be smarter than their peers and more likely to get into trouble. Individuals with feminine faces are perceived as more trustworthy. That comes from our gender stereotypes. Individuals with masculine faces are perceived as more competent. As it happened, we can, using our models, we can really tease apart what's the competence stereotype. One is attractiveness, which benefits women on average. But you can actually remove, literally subtract the attractiveness and see what's left, and it's masculinity. And in some ways, it is a sad fact, but it's not surprising from a statistical learning perspective. Because if you're exposed to more and more male leaders, that's where the stereotype comes from. Even worse, actually, we can now we can sort of inject masculinity in real faces, and when you're making a male face more and more masculine, it's perceived as more competent. And if you do this for a female face, at some point it breaks down because of the gender stereotypes. The gender stereotypes, and they tend to be much more prescriptive for women than men. It's like you don't, the stereotype is going against dominant-looking masculine women. So that's a characteristic you associate with leaders, but if it's too much in a woman, you get a negative response. So this is where it's all, this is like lots of findings showing you how you have these specific inputs that influence your impressions. The other thing that is really important to know, and it's not immediately obvious, that image variation, even if it's random, can generate completely different impressions of the same person. We are oblivious to this fact because image variation is relatively unimportant for familiar faces. I walked in and the person who was at the reception said, "Oh, you're coming for the," I said, "I'm the speaker." He's like, "Oh, yeah, but that's, I didn't recognize." I was like, "Of course not. You don't know me. Next time you might recognize me, but recognition is difficult." And first impressions are about unfamiliar faces. So if I ask you, who do you like more from the two women on the top side? Probably you'll guess the woman on the left. How about on the lower side? Well, probably the woman on the right side. Well, actually, this is the same woman, this row, and the first column is another woman. Now, notice that if you're familiar with these two individuals, it would be totally trivial for you, and you'll go with the person you like because of what they're like and what you know about them. But for us, we know nothing. So you end up making this judgment. So that's just image variation. This was a study done by actually the Canon Lab, the photography lab in Australia. They brought 5 professional photographers, and they meet Michael, who is an actor, and each photographer is given a false piece of information. That's like a social psychology experiment right now. And so some are told Michael is self-made millionaire. Some are told he's an ex-convict. He's a psychic. And then they spend some time to draw the essence of Michael. And then they go, and the photography is beautiful and totally different. And they're like, what? How did you come up with? Well, and then it all makes sense, because who is the self-made millionaire here? And who is the ex-convict? Right? It's the same person. Basing on these false preconceptions, you end up with very different images. If I ask you how many individuals are shown here, it would be more than 3. The model guess is 5. It's actually 2. Why is this so difficult? Because you don't know them. Now, this guy, if I have to form an impression of this guy, I don't want to hang out with him. He looks like a skinhead. It is the same guy. He's actually a very talented social psychologist. He's done beautiful work on familiarity. He's in the Dutch psychologist in the UK. Notice that this is totally different, contrasted with familiar faces. There is just as much variation in these images, even more, like length of the hair, facial hair, age. Yet, if you know who Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio are, boom, it's instantaneous. And not only that, but it's not only that you recognize them, but also that the recognition comes with knowledge. The movies you've seen them, their attitudes, political, and this is whether you like them or not, it really unlocks your memory. But that's the case when you know them. When you don't know anything about the person, the images don't provide any magic path to what the person is like. It is an illusion based on our experience with familiar faces. And in the case of unfamiliar images, they can unlock only our stereotypes. Okay, I'm rushing a little bit here because I'm running out of time. Let me tell you a little bit about the new applications, machine learning applications. So here's one. I'll just focus on one specific study. And this study, the algorithm is trained on images of people on online dating websites, and in fact predicts much better than chance the sexual orientation of the users. Let me say that I have no problems with the finding is real. We do leave digital trace of our personality and preferences, and this could be detected by powerful algorithms. And that's a fact, right? Now, the problem is that you have a confound, what we call it in experimental psychology. The images are self-posted, right? They're selected. They're not people. The users didn't randomly select an image like, that's my dating website image, right? You presumably think carefully what to select. So the detection is not about honest facial signal of sexual orientation. The other problem with this algorithm is it's like a big black box. So you get a decision that is better than chance, and then you're trying to figure out, but what's in the box, right? And so what is it exactly that it's picking up? And so you're trying to double guess. So here, creating a composite image of your heterosexual male and female faces, and also of the straight and gay faces, male and women. Okay, so what can you see? Well, there's clearly differences in grooming, right? Male face is shaven, unshaven. Female face is makeup, eyeliner. But it also appears that there are morphological differences. Chin, nose, forehead. And that presumably may reflect differential hormone exposure. That was the interpretation in the paper. Now notice, like, the straight guy has a much bigger chin and smaller forehead. And that's me, if you can recognize it by now. So we do signal many things about ourselves, right? And some of this signaling is quite deliberate, but some is fairly implicit. We want specific aspirations. You want to belong to particular groups. That's reflected in how you dress. That's reflected in lots of other things that you might not even be aware. A powerful AI algorithm can capture these cultural signals. No problems. I mean, they're there to be captured. But this is very different from saying, oh, this actually, there is a biological signal. There's like a direct mapping from something, the broadness of your chin and your particular preferences. That is where there's no strong data to suggest this, at least so far. So we do rapidly infer from faces things that most of the time are not very controversial, like age, gender. And what we do, we construct these personality impressions from these first-order inferences. You can think of these basic mental states, emotional states. But even the first-order preferences are inaccurate, overestimating the role of the face. Let me just show you one more study. So these are tennis players after they just won or lost a point. Now, if I ask you who won and who lost, we know people are totally a chance. In fact, I have to put it in my notes because I never remember. But 1, 4, and 6 lost, and 2, 3, and 5 won. Now, just the face by itself doesn't give you any information. You know there's high arousal, something, and this you get with pain, pleasure, all of this stuff. You know there's high arousal, but you don't know what the direction of the emotion is. The body actually completely determines the accurate inference. We never did a careful analysis, but when you lose, usually you're like this, and when you win, you're like that. But once having the face in the body doesn't help you much. If you just show the body, that does the trick. Now, though, this is interesting. When you show the intact images of the people in experiments, they say, well, I think the right guess comes from the face. Why? Because that's where you pay attention. The disambiguation is very rapid, and you immediately know what's happening. But we know it's not in the face. Note that we don't conduct this kind of experiments in everyday life, right? You really need to break down the stimuli to figure out what's the informational signal. And there's no way to learn. There's just, unless you do this sort of experiment. So why do we have all of this? I think I'll be on time. Well, in the absence of good information, which is whenever you interact with strangers and you don't have any reliable information, we rely on first impressions to infer their intentions, their capabilities, and we rely on lots of things. It's not just facial appearance, expressions, accent. Accents are big. I mean, there are lots of great people working in the psychology department on the role of accents and perceptions. Voice, body language. You get exactly the same first impressions from voice, even from single words and single sentences, the same way you get this for faces. Attire, context of the situation, and so on and so on. And all of this is integrated very rapidly. In a sense, so it is the way I like to think of the functional role of first impression is a shortcut of dealing with the complexity of living with strangers. Some of these impressions might be accurate here and now. If somebody is disgruntled, they're probably not going to help you. And somebody is kind of happy looking, maybe on average they're more likely to help you. But it is an inaccurate as a guide about characteristics that are stable over time and situations. And with this, I will conclude with Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, who was probably one of the most interesting and least known 18th century thinkers. He was the first chair of experimental physics in Germany, posthumously credited with introducing the aphorism in German language. Fascinating character, and the reason he's very interesting to me, he wrote an essay that completely took apart Lavater's ideas on essay physiognomy, and you will see why he's credited with his writing abilities. As he put it, first impressions lend the smallest possible knowledge, the greatest possible appearance of it. Consider someone wise who acts wisely, and do not be misled by irregularities on the surface. And with this, thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Alex. We have some microphones for people who have questions, but there are some questions from our viewers online, and I just wanted to start with one of those. How stable are first impressions?
So this is another thing that it's actually very easy to change your impressions if you have the opportunity to interact with the person and observe them. But if you don't, there's a problem, because what's problematic with first impression is that they kind of preclude opportunities, right? I decide I'm not going to interact with this person. I'm not going to get into economic transaction because I don't trust them. That's a problem if, in fact, that's a potential cooperative partner, right? They just preclude an opportunity you will never learn. So I think this is their largest effect. But if you do an experimental game where you actually measure actual cooperation and you do repeated interactions, people very quickly figure out, oh, okay, this person might look trustworthy, but they don't behave trustworthy, and they change their behavior accordingly.
Thank you. So following up on that, how stable are these sorts of impressions in different cultures? For instance, in Northern Europe, where people are really used to women leaders and prime ministers, do they interpret a woman's competence differently?
So this is culture is hugely important, and certainly in Northern Europe, you have a way higher political representation of women, and so you get a somewhat different effects, what's predictive in different elections and different cultures. It's also, we have done one study, this is somewhat different, but you're absolutely right. Stereotypes change when reality changes. Often it's not the case that attitudes first change and behavior follows. Typically behavior change and attitudes follow. So if you have a higher women representation, all of this starts changing. But we've done a study, for example, with Israelis and Japanese young women, and then you can create a more from very typical Japanese to typical Israeli, and you ask them to say, well, how trustworthy is the faith? And guess what? The more Israeli becomes, the more trustworthy looks to Israelis. The more Japanese it becomes, the more trustworthy Japanese. And it's not the case for attractiveness. Attractiveness, actually, the mixed ethnicity faces have a little bit of a advantage. So culture is definitely important, and what you expose. One way always good to think about how do you end up with specific preference in faces is to think of faces that your statistical diet of faces, what kinds of faces you exposed in your everyday life. And that would change what's typical, and we like things that are typical, we're trusting, and so on and so on.
There's been a lot of news lately about facial recognition technology, especially in societies like China. And I'm just curious what impact or connection there is between your research and what's going on there.
Yeah, so I've been following some of this. It is related, and it's very interesting because people who have taught intro to psychology, probably Boaz, you have taught this, but we were 10, 15 years ago, we would say, computers are much better than humans in serial, recognition, but pattern matching, forget it. Look at faces, and then that's all history. So as a general rule, these algorithms are more powerful than humans. But then there's lots of training biases. And there's two things that make an algorithm good. One is the architecture of the algorithm, and the other is the training space. And there have always been competitions, world competition on based face recognition algorithms. One year, the best were from Europe and from Asia. And again, proprietary information, you're trying to guess what they're doing. It turns out the Asian algorithms do better on Asian faces, the European algorithms do better on European faces. Why? Because of the bias in the training data set. And often with minority recognition, you have all kinds of problems. And there are lots of, they can do better on average, but there's some difficult decisions where even the best algorithms fail. So it's always, the recommendation is it just as another piece of evidence, but it seems that the practice is much more than that because people put so much more faith in this kind of technology and generally in face recognition. Another side effect, the major reason for wrongful convictions, eyewitness testimony. It accounts for above 70% of wrongful convictions. So
I think we have time for one more question here.
My question is kind of related to the culture question. So how quickly do you notice the stereotypes of a society or culture change based on the social movements? For example, in the US, there's more awareness around like women empowerment, for example, or like more social movements around race and gender, do you see the societal stereotypes related to faces change, and how quickly can that
Well,
happen?
I don't know about, this is a much tougher question. I mean, there's a lot of work changing stereotypes, let's say gender stereotypes over the last 50 years, and there's big changes for the better. And that seems to really, the changes becomes when you suddenly have a big participation of the women in the labor force. Whether that would change, I mean, I would think that would also change perceptions. I mean, it will change also impressions from faces. Again, it's whatever models you expose to, and going back to the same idea of your statistical data faces. But it takes time. I mean, like you look, this research that is decades of data. And yeah. Okay.
All right, thanks so much, Alex.
Thank you.